Okay, so now we're going to be talking about poetry with the background of painting. Let me try and do a quick recap. I started writing, well actually when I was at junior school we were introduced to poetry, and I remember Macefield, Sea Fever and G.K. Chesterton, The Rolling English Road, before the Roman came to Rye, or out to Severn strode. The rolling English drunkard made the rolling English road. There were words in it I didn't understand. Fast forward to being a teenager, probably about 15, 16, and I discovered various things, including a girlfriend in due course, and poetry as written by Adrian Henry and T.S. Eliot. I think they were the things that really turned me on to poetry, because I could understand them. And they had subjects which I could relate to. T.S. Eliot had a yellow fog rubbing its back upon the window panes, and Adrian Henry had yellow daffodils. There seems to be a theme of yellow occurring here. That wasn't really necessary, any colour would do. But I can understand, I can relate to them. They were evocative. They generated a feeling in me which I found I liked. And I write my own poems. Obviously those poets wrote in rhyme and free verse. Most of my poetry at that time was free verse, with an attempt at rhyming here and there. Remember one about my father. This man was so brave. This man was no slave of fear. It takes guts to fight with a spider. My revenge on him, because I learnt to handle spiders. I got myself to, get used to them. I wouldn't do it now because there seem to be like rather nasty ones occurring, but they seem to be relatively harmless at the time. So that's teenage years, and I guess I kind of petered out a bit. I'm summarising and rapidly moving on to 1975, when I was, how old was I then? 53 to 75 is... 22. Thank you for the maths. I thought I might be 22. Actually it's 73, so I must have been 19 or 20. Anyway, I decided I don't know why, but I just decided I wanted to learn to write in metre and rhyme. And I found I did learn after a couple of months, but it was like mental torture because I couldn't understand it. I mean, there's meant to be some kind of metre in poetry, some kind of difference to give you a rhythm, but it all sounded exactly the same. It just sounded flat to me. But anyway, I did learn by kind of repeating and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and then having words that sounded like that. And 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, the tree is red, the sky is blue, and then getting slightly more sophisticated. So I learned to do it. And then I was writing in rhyme. At that point, I was reading everything. I could get my hands on, Dryden, Pope, W.H. Auden, John Betjeman, obscure people like Arthur Shirley Cripps. I found these old books from the 20s and 30s. And some of those were really useful as kind of models to sort of satirise. So Arthur Shirley Cripps would write this poem about England, England, England being very, what's the word when you support your nation? Jingoistic, whatever. So instead of England, 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 I would write Romford, Romford, Romford. And instead of his soldiers or whatever, I'd have transvestites and gays and stuff, so updating it. But it's a useful model to follow. I think at that time, then I got particularly into John Betjeman, especially his LPs set to music by Jim Parker, he's reading poetry over the music, which were amazing. So yeah, he definitely became a very strong inspiration and model, although I tried to find my own subjects, my own voice, obviously through that, and yeah, I read lots of stuff at that time. And also became involved with the Medway Poets. So we're talking about 1979. I was just finishing at Maidstone Art College, and I met up with some poets in the area. Bill Lewis, Billy Childish, then there was Sexton Ming, Rob Earl, and my girlfriend at the time was Miriam Carney, and the six of us were in a group which was called the Medway Poets, which I think Bill Lewis named. That was an intense, turbulent, pressured time, like being in a pressure cooker of poetry. And I think we all, well, certainly I did, and I think some of the others did also, sort of pushed on through that period, influencing each other, encouraging each other, and I think basically finding each other as our best audience. Although at times we were a very bad audience in terms of heckling and stuff, but well, Billy was heckling, that is, I wasn't, Bill Lewis wasn't. But in a way, who else was going to really appreciate what we were doing? Well, other people did. We'd gone on TV South and a documentary, were invited to the International Cambridge Poetry Festival, etc. So we were doing quite well, but there was a lot of antagonism, well, particularly between Billy and me. And so the group sort of dissolved. What am I doing? I'm talking about the history of my poetry. I was still doing painting, but I felt the painting was problematic psychologically. It was so negative. Both my poetry and painting was influenced by punk very strongly, but the painting in particular I felt had a bit of a sort of nihilistic, negative input more than the poetry. I felt the poetry was more mature. I felt also at that point I wanted to make a living from my art rather than just working on the hospital switchboard for the rest of my life, part-time. And I decided that I was already earning more money from poetry. That was the thing, so I got rid of all my painting stuff. I guess this was about 1982. Got rid of it all, the easels, the brushes, the paints. I put all my drawings, I tore them in half. I got my paintings, which I'd done on cardboard, corrugated cardboard boxes, and tore them in half, and I was going to put them all in the bin, but the trouble is the bin was too full to put them all in. So I didn't. I waited till the next week, and by the next week I didn't bother, and I still got them all torn in half. So I did the poetry, and I got more and more involved with writing children's poetry because there's a lot of children's poetry publishing going on. And I went around schools and did performances and workshops and earned a lot of money, and that carried on for about 13 years until I became very jaded with that. And I then did the process in reverse. I gave up the poetry, which was a little bit hard because, you know, I was quite successful. I'd had work in over 100 anthologies for children published by Penguin and Oxford Press and Macmillan and, you know, big publishers. So I was, you know, one of the leading children's poets in the country. I had a couple of small collections brought out for children by Collins and their educational series. But I had to get back into painting. I didn't want to. I was very resistant, but it was like this urge, this kind of drive, like, you know, it was out of my control. And I thought I was making a big mistake. Maybe I was. So I gave up the poetry. I'd already given up writing for adults anyway because I was writing so much stuff for children, and I got back into painting. That was like around about 1997, the Stuckis. I founded the Stuckis, had that idea, and Billy Childish agreed to co-found it with me in 1999. And I suppose by 2000 I had given up the children's poetry and I was just doing painting again. The interesting thing was, through doing the poetry for the preceding years, I felt I had matured So when I went back into painting, I went back with a different state of mind. So the one that I had previously, which I felt was very negative, which was self-destructive, I no longer had. I had a very positive view, and that fed into the paintings, slightly to my surprise. And I did the paintings again up until about maybe 3 years ago. What year are we in now? 2024, so probably about 2020, something like that, 2009, end of 2019, about 4 years ago. I got kind of really enthused. I wouldn't say obsessed, because it was more like a sort of constant revelation. Partly because my house was filled with builders who were constructing extensions, and I couldn't do painting. There was too much going on, and so I tinkered with the poems. I had loads of poems from my earlier period, which I needed to revise, type out and stuff. Started doing that, got into writing loads of new poems, and in about a year I'd written 400 poems. I just seemed to come, the poems. You know, I just thought of something and the next minute it was a poem. Slightly problematic, because every thought turned into a poem. And you are thinking quite a lot of things, so there are quite a lot of poems. That was absolutely amazing. Then I did some other things with poetry. I worked on a lot of traditional poems and revised them with my own technique, and there's a collection of those waiting. I also wrote a rejoinder to Ted Hughes' book of Crow poems. I thought I'd write Crow's poems about Ted Hughes, and that's another book. Which sort of brings us up to the present, and definitely another step forward. Not a repetition, it's a step forward. I think instead of my earlier main inspiration and model of John Betjeman, this time round it's been Charles Bukowski. Not his earlier stuff, which I find far too complex and quite often pretentious, but he evolved into writing simply and clearly about a lot of his everyday experiences. I don't particularly approve of Charles Bukowski, but I do approve of the way he wrote about his life in terms of the technique and the language. And I suppose that's given me an incentive or a model to write in that kind of way about my life and my thoughts, which are very different to his. Well, a lot of them are anyway. And again, I've suddenly found a really prolific period of writing when everything suddenly becomes a poem, and I'm writing 5, 6, 7, 8 poems a night. I should say, when I got back into poetry again about 4 years ago, whenever it was, 2020-ish, I adopted a different technique. Technically, I adopted a different approach. Before, I'd always written poems on bits of paper and then typed them up. What I started doing was dictating them into my phone, which then turned them into a text file, which I could work on the computer. And I found that very liberating. The actual technique, the necessity of writing slowed things down, obstructed things, and made me having to think of something else. Instead of just creating the words, the poems, I was having to think about the process of writing, which is a different thing. It's like trying to be a manager and a worker at the same time. It's better if you divide the roles. So just being able to speak the poem was an amazing liberation. And I suddenly made me very prolific. And that's what I'm doing at the moment, the same thing. I've moved on a bit because I'm finding even more I can look at ordinary things in life and they've got a value to them, which is more than a value I'd really considered them to have previously. But I did realise a long time ago that things, I mean, okay, I was talking to Jasmine Surreal, who's also started looking at her old poems and creating new ones, I think partly through my kind of deranged influence. And Joe Machine said he's starting writing poems. But Jasmine said, well, what's the point of writing? She's saying something or doing something, and I'm saying, this is a poem, write it down. And she's saying, what's the point? No one's going to be interested. I said, they will be interested. You're not interested because to you it's ordinary. But for other people elsewhere, and for people later on, it won't be ordinary. It will be something different, something they haven't experienced. Mind you, another thing is that people often speak poetry, and she does this particularly well. She's saying something, I said, that's brilliant, write it down, write it down. And she said, well, I know it's kind of good, I know it's like poetry. I said, yeah, but you've got to write it down, otherwise it'll be lost forever. And then she might say, well, I don't want to write a poem. I don't want to write a poem about that. Fair enough, okay. Well, write it what you do want to write about. Anyway, she's decided for herself, obviously, what she wants to do, and she is doing that. So there's a little bit of a poetry revival going on in some of my associates as well. And I'd like to talk about some of my associates. I mean, Jasmine writes her own surreal, kind of scathing poetry, to the extent, apparently, when she used to read it out, afterwards people would talk to her and say, oh, you're really nice. We thought you were going to be this kind of heartless, callous, cruel bitch, but you're so pleasant to talk to. She's got this other side to her, comes out in the poetry, sometimes comes out towards me. Joe Machine, he's a very clear writer, writes wonderful observations about just going for a walk and seeing different things on his walk. And then there's my old, well, Wolf Howard is a really good writer. A brilliant poem about working in a frozen shepherd's pie factory. And the man opposite says, watch out, they're coming down the conveyor belt really fast. And Joe looks in the distance for this thing trundling slowly towards him. He's very witty, very clear writer. Philip Absalon's been around a long time with quirky work. These Medway Poets, Bill Lewis obviously was a leading member, and his stuff's brilliant. I mean, he's got genius in his poems, and it's an absolute outrage that he's not more widely recognised. He writes very clearly with things that are mind-boggling. For example, he's saying, I opened a door to a room that didn't exist until I entered it. Everybody can understand that, but as for fathoming what it means, is it just a little mind trick, is it a fantasy, or is it actually symbolising something more significant? I mean, that's just a snippet, but he's got one poem after another that just hit the bullseye. And Billy Charges is absolutely prolific. He's continued to write for the last, well, how long has it been since Medway Poets? getting on 44 years, 45 years since Medway Poets. He's still writing. I suppose he writes a bit in the Bukowski mode of clarity about his everyday life. I kind of dismissed a lot of his early work because it seemed to me to be very negative and kind of deliberately trading on the sort of outsider, desperate anti-hero with warts on his cock and stuff like that. I therefore missed out on some of the stuff that wasn't like that at all, which was a different quality, and certainly he's evolved. He still does some of the stuff like the early work, but he's definitely evolved in spiritually, psychologically, emotionally. I think his having a son, giving up drink all helped, doing Buddhist meditation, and this is all fed in. So he's one of these people that has evolved. He started off in a negative spot. He's come out of that, because if you keep in that, it's very self-destructive. So he hasn't kept in that. He's reached a different stage. I don't think Rob Earl's written so much recently, not for a long time from what I gather. But his stuff again, he had a lot of very good early work. One was brilliant about the Holocaust. 6 million killed in Nazi terror was in fact a typing error, Holocaust denial. Sexton Ming continues to do stuff. His stuff was always one-off, unique, eccentric. There's a woman called Mimi who was in a train to Strood, who during the journey ate a cherry tree, things like that. And he did a lot of stuff about the Bloomsbury group and giving them quirky adventures. He's also a musician, as of course is Billy Childish. And Miriam Carney, I don't know if she's writing anymore, but her early stuff consisted a lot of gems of observation about sometimes simple things about hoovering at 2 a.m, oddities of life, and I must say a really stunning poem about her vagina, described in intricate detail. But it is an outstanding poem. And something about her is that I think she was an early model for Tracey Emin, because she was on a TV programme with Billy Childish when Tracey had just started going out with him. She put him on a pedestal, and there was Miriam on this TV programme reading her poems out in the same platform as Billy was in the programme. She must have looked at that and thought, that's where I want to be. I want to be on the platform alongside, equal to Billy. Because at that time she was just completely obsessed and mesmerised with Billy. Everything Billy was doing, because Tracey was an 18-year-old fashion student, not an artist at all. And she took a lot of stuff from the Medway Poets, which she incorporated later in her work, particularly a lot of stuff from Billy. That is a different story. Now, coming back to my poems, that's my current state. I'm sort of painfully aware that I haven't done poetry, especially adult poetry, for a long time. I haven't put it out there. I'm also sort of painfully aware that I am now somehow or another have become 70 years old by mistake. It wasn't what I intended to happen, but it has happened. I have to accept it. So, I haven't got a whole lifetime. Well, I have got a lifetime, but a shorter one. I haven't got 50 years, 60 years to kind of look forward to a poetry career, because I'll be 130 and that's not likely to happen. So I want to get it out there. I want to get it published. I have changed a bit from kind of quite liking myself to be prominent, which I'm not really interested in. I kind of now feel that I want myself to be withdrawn, but I want the poems to be prominent. I want the work to be out there. I want people to be able to read it, share it. People that want to. People that don't. People, if they don't like it, I'm not interested, And people want to criticise it, well, don't bother, just say it's rubbish. Okay, fine, if you want to. That's not very helpful for me, because I've got something which I think is of value, and I'm interested in people that are going to also find it of value in their lives. And at the moment, my audience consists of one person, which is Joe Machine, because I know we're on the same wavelength. He will understand what I'm doing. If I write something that's crap, I'm sure he'll say it is. I don't think I'm not sure if anything I'm writing at the moment is crap, because if it is, I tend to cross it out. I get rid of it, I don't keep it. If you're doing something creative, you've got to develop your own ability for self-appraisal as soon as possible. In the early days, you might well need somebody else's help to give you feedback. But as time goes on, you develop your own feeling for what you're doing as to whether it's hitting the bullseye or missing the target altogether. And if you're in the right place in yourself and you've got the skill then you will hit the bullseye.